right, good afternoon, everybody. We will maybe give 1 or 2 more minutes, and then I'll do a quick intro, Bill, for you, our distinguished guest speaker today, and we can just jump right into the conversation. But very much looking forward to today's presentation. So
I'm pretty intimidated by the crowd. Like I know something more about design than you guys. That's a ridiculous thought.
well, we're looking forward to the conversation regardless. And very much,
You
yeah.
can fake it, Bill. Don't worry.
You can what?
You can fake it. Don't worry.
I'll fake, but that's what I've done my whole life, Mike, as you well know. So
I would say, yeah, I believe Vicky was seconding that opinion. Most of us have as well.
Bill, you're the first real planner we've seen since you left.
well, I'm not quite sure that's true. I actually, thinking about the recent planning directors of San Diego, I have to say I almost went to law school. Might have lasted longer as the planning director of San Diego if I'd gone to law school, right?
Local politics are terrible.
Local politics are, yeah, but there are, for better or worse, they are important.
Yeah. Weren't you the mayor of Ventura at one time?
I was.
Probably not as political as we are in San Diego.
Oh, don't be so sure. All the projects I voted in favor of in 2007 are now being built in Ventura, and that's riling everybody up.
Well, it's nice to know that even though it's 17 years later, they do in fact get built.
They do in fact get built sooner or later. That's right. It's taken a while.
Yes. Well, wonderful. I will, on that note, I'm going to jump in and give a brief introduction to our speaker, who is obviously well known within our community, and we're very glad to have him back today, joining us for this meeting of the Regional Design Advisory Committee. As a reminder, we are a subcommittee of the Advocacy Chair and the Advocacy Group under AIA San Diego. And we are a big tent group that is attempting to reach out and sort of bridge the gap between different professional organizations and encourage a broad discourse on issues affecting our region and the development of the broader San Diego region. Today, I'm delighted to have Bill Fulton joining us. Bill is a nationally recognized expert on urban design, land use policy, and economic development. He is a senior advisor at PFM Management and Budgeting Consulting, a fellow at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley, and a visiting policy designer at the UCSD Design Lab. His broad experience and accomplished career include past positions such as serving as the mayor of Ventura, California, the director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University, vice president of policy and implementation at Smart Growth America, and a senior fellow at the USC Price School of Public Policy. Locally, Bill served as the director of planning and economic development for the city of San Diego, and recently has helped facilitate Mayor Todd Gloria's working group on middle-income housing in 2021 and 2022. He's also consulted on the coordination of growth management strategies among regional agencies across the county of San Diego. Bill is also an accomplished author, having published hundreds of articles and studies, and in addition to 8 books, including Place and Prosperity, How Cities Help Us Connect and Innovate, which was published in 2022, The Regional City, Planning for the End of Sprawl, The Reluctant Metropolis, The Politics of Urban Growth in Los Angeles, and the seminal Guide to California Planning, which is currently in its 6th edition. Very excited to hear, Bill, what you have to share with us today, and looking forward to a discussion on recent updates to our state and local housing policy and how the design community can engage with those developments here locally in San Diego. So please, everybody, welcome Bill Fulton today for what I anticipate to be a lively discussion. Thanks, Bill.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and hello, everybody. As I said at the outset, I'm pretty intimidated by this crowd. I am by no means a designer. I went to planning school at UCLA at the nadir of right before the new urbanists and at the nadir of design. I'm a policy and strategy guy. I'm thrilled to be. I've been back in San Diego almost a year now from Texas. I'm thrilled to be back, and I'm thrilled to be involved in the regional discussions about policy and other things here in San Diego. I'm going to share my screen if I can find the right thing. There we go. As Jonathan said, I have like 5 part-time jobs. I am working. Is that set up right on your screen now? Hold on, let me see. Yeah, that's set up. I have like 5 part-time. Yeah, I have like 5 part-time jobs. I am visiting at UCSD. I'm coming to you today from Park and Market, where I usually go to work. I am continuing to be affiliated with the Turner Center, and I do a lot of consulting, mostly on the budget and management side with PFM, a little bit of affordable housing finance, and then on my own through William Fulton Group, I do some land use and economic development planning. I thought about this, I remembered when I went to the, I guess it was about a year ago, I went to the Seaside Prize in Seaside, Florida, the seminal new urbanist development, because one of my mentors, one of my professors at UCLA, Don Shoup, was being honored. And there was a wide variety of people there, a lot of new urbanist designers, Andreas Twani, people like that, but also some YIMBYs were there. Nolan Gray from California YIMBY was there. And I remember sitting next to my old friend, Rick Cole, who many of you probably know, once and future mayor of Pasadena. He just got reelected to the city council in Pasadena. He was my city manager in Ventura, and then later the executive director of the Congress for New Urbanism. And he whispered in my ear as Nolan was talking, well, you know that the YIMBYs don't care about design. All they care about is housing production. So I think that there is a tension kind of going on between housing production and design right now, which is emerging out of the changes in the state laws. So that's what I want to talk about today, and then have a little discussion with you. I do, Jonathan, have a very hard stop at 1, I'm sorry to say. One of the things that is really extraordinary is just how, most of you know this, is just how expensive housing in California has become. If you look back on this chart to the 1950, 1960, there was always a sunshine tax, you might say, on housing in California. Traditionally, housing was about 20% more expensive than housing elsewhere in the country. Really took off in the 70s. That, of course, is when a lot of the planning laws, including CEQA, were adopted. Tailed off in the 90s and has gotten really worse. This only goes to 2015, but it skyrocketed even more after that. So California housing the median home price in California is now $800,000 or $900,000, probably closer to 8 at this point because it's gone down a little bit. But that's compared to about 350 or 400 nationally. And the other thing we've seen is a pretty significant decline in overall housing production. We used to do, even back in the 2000s here, where you see we were doing 200,000 housing units a year in California. In the last 8 years, it's been 100, 110, maybe 120 in a good year for a state of 40 million people, which by some estimates is about a couple of million housing units short. You can see, particularly in the coastal areas, the percentage increase in supply has declined a lot. Well, this has gotten everybody's attention, especially the legislature's attention, and that has led to very significant changes in laws about land use and housing that indirectly have affected design a lot. There have been, this is just to give you an idea, there have been dozens, if not hundreds, of laws passed having to do with land use issues associated with housing. What you see here is an article, a brief for the Turner Center that I helped write, and a shot of Turner Center's database of literally hundreds of bills, most of which have to do one way or another with land use and zoning, and indirectly with design. I don't have to tell you that what's been happening statewide and also very aggressively at the city of San Diego is streamlining permitting processes, creating ways around CEQA, creating ministerial approvals, by right approvals, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Certain requirements have to be met that have some effect on design, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So some of the most significant things that have happened. Number one is since 2017, we have seen the emergence of a whole accessory dwelling unit industry that did not exist before. Something like 20% of all housing unit permits in California today are for ADUs. Nobody knows how many of those ADUs are actually being rented in the market. Many of them are being used for families. Many of them are just being used for offices or extra space for families. But we saw an explosion. We've seen 25,000. We see thousands of ADUs permitted in the city of LA every year, where the number prior to 2017 was in the teens or in the hundreds. And when I say an industry, I mean an industry, because there are companies now that you go online, they show you their prefabricated models. You pick one, and they bring it out with a crane and they drop it in your backyard. San Diego's been extremely aggressive with the bonus ADU law, as most of you know, where you can do multiple ADUs as long as some of them are affordable and you still meet within the FAR requirements, which has led in some cases to quite a few units on single family homes. The other thing that's really important to understand, which nobody paid any attention to, including me, until about 2018, is a law called the Housing Accountability Act, which has been on the books since the 80s or the 90s. It creates very narrow grounds for denying a housing project, and particularly an affordable housing project. And it in its recent incarnation, it has stimulated or required this move toward objective standards, including objective design standards, not subjective standards, as a basis for denial. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. And in addition, as you probably have heard, any city that does not have an approved housing element, how it gets approved is a matter of litigation. But any city that does not have a housing element that meets the requirements of state law is open to the builder's remedy. That is also a 30 or 40-year-old aspect of state law, but it basically allows developers to come in and build whatever they want by right, no matter what is proposed, no matter what the zoning says. Buffy Wicks, who is an assembly member from the East Bay, introduced a bill the other day to kind of box it in a little bit, but nevertheless, that has scared the heck out of everybody. It's also true that the density bonus law has created enormous increases in density, allows increased heights, the density bonus law allows a 50 to 80% increase in density over local zoning, as long as there's some affordable housing. It allows increased heights. And just as important, and I'll give you a San Diego example about this in a minute, it requires the cities to give up concessions and waivers such as parking standards, open space, and other development standards if the developer requests it. This is a very controversial rendering of a proposed development project in the Sunset District of San Francisco, which complies with all state laws. This can be built under the density bonus law. Whether or not they're really going to build it or the developer just did this to scare everybody, nobody knows. But this is the kind of thing that we have seen. One local example, back to the question of not just increased density, but also giving up concessions and waivers. Many of you will remember the litigation over this project in Bankers Hill. Not only the neighbors sued, the city was the defendant, actually. The neighbors sued and lost. Not only is it taller and more dense than would be allowed under standard zoning, there are a variety of waivers and concessions that the city had basically no choice but to accept, including eliminating the setback on one street, eliminating some loading spaces, and reducing the number of private storage areas for residents. There was a big debate as well on this project about the interior courtyard and why the developer was retaining the interior courtyard while seeking waivers and concessions on the exterior design elements. So this is the kind of thing that you see emerging from state law that is now playing itself out, in a kind of an indirect way with design. There's also two new laws that allow significant changes here. There is in areas around transit. San Diego already had this, as many of you know, and I'll give you an example in a minute. But now it's a state law that in areas near transit or areas that have low vehicle miles traveled, and that's a whole different subject. The state says you can't have any mandatory parking. Doesn't mean you can't provide parking, but it does mean that the cities can't mandate parking. And also by state law, housing is now permitted in all commercial areas, whether local zoning allows it or not. That raised the question of how do you decide what's allowable if you have a district that's zoned for commercial and that is not zoned for residential, what residential standards do you put on it? And the law says you pick up the residential standards from the closest residentially developed property. San Diego has been unusually aggressive in allowing density and allowing more development in local areas. You're all familiar with Andrew Malick's Parkline project on El Cajon Boulevard in North Park. The story behind this was when he bought the property or took control of the property, the community plan allowed 27 units. The community plan then changed, and he was on the community planning board, changed to allow 41 units. Then El Cajon Boulevard is a transit priority area, which gave him 100% bonus. That gave him 82 units. And then after construction, when he realized he could not rent the co-working spaces he had created, particularly those up on the very top there that you see, he flipped those under local ordinance to ADUs. So he wound up with 94 units where when he acquired or gained control of the property, I don't know whether he literally acquired it, it called for 27. He's also got only 28 parking spaces. He has 100 bicycle parking spaces, which are all full. He also has in the lobby a giant screen telling you when the next express bus comes by. You will probably all know this story, but just kind of an aside, he did not do a deal. He was unsuccessful in acquiring the chicken pie shop property. So as part of his project, he cleaned it up and made it look a little nicer. But the point here is, under the local ordinances that are now in place in San Diego, he went from 27 to 94 without a whole lot of trouble. So given this fact, I mean, if you go back and look at some of these slides, if you look at this slide, and you look at this slide, and you look at this slide, you got to ask yourself, what role does design play in all this, right? Because design is a fussy business. It is not cut and dried. It is not a units per acre business. So how can design, and going back to the point that I made when I started to the Rick Cole story, that YIMBYs don't care about design, that's an overstatement, but it's not entirely wrong. They are more concerned with housing production than they are with design. What can designers do? Well, the fact that objective standards have been introduced as part of the state law creates a kind of an opportunity. There are increasingly what you're seeing is cities adopting objective design standards. That is to say, very specific design requirements, no squishiness, no, hey, that doesn't look okay. I don't know, it should be better. But rather, here's the design target, you hit the target and you're approved. Whoops. To give you an example, this is from RRM's work in Encinitas. What is an objective design standard? a subjective standard according to RRM lacks specificity and may allow arbitrary interpretation. I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute, causing incompatible design, undesirable outcomes. It's qualitative and ambiguous. Objective design standards are design standards that either you hit the mark or you don't. This is very different than what designers are used to doing. It's also very different than what planning commissions are used to doing. Planning commissions, many of whom, as you know better than I do, have planners and architects on them, are accustomed to doing, and particularly design review committees, if they exist, are accustomed to doing a very, very qualitative analysis of whether or not the design is appropriate. I'll give you an example from Huntington Beach. Huntington Beach, as you may know, now controlled by MAGA Republicans, is the most recalcitrant city in the state about accepting the state requirements for housing. How a MAGA Republican becomes a NIMBY, I don't know, but that is what has happened in Huntington Beach. This is a project, sort of a before and a rendering of after project on Beach. This is not literally on Beach Boulevard, but it's in the Beach Boulevard corridor in Huntington Beach. You can see it was a car wash and stuff before. The developer came along and proposed a 48. Is a very long, narrow lot. What you see on the left there is actually the front. The big stuff is on the side. The developer proposed, and I don't remember how big the property was, but 48 condominiums. The city of Huntington Beach rejected this project because this planning commission relied on subjective standards in the code, like ensure that new development projects are of compatible portion, scale, and character to complement adjoining uses. Well, that's the wiggle room that planning commissions always used, right, to force developers and designers to redesign projects. Under objective design standards, that's simply not possible. I didn't put this in, but my recollection is that another standard that was in play in the Huntington Beach project had to do with ingress and egress, and it simply said there needed to be sufficient space for safe ingress and egress. And so the planning commission said, oh, it doesn't have sufficient space. You turn right, da-da. They had all this stuff. And then what happened in court was the city got overturned and had to approve this project eventually because subjective standards like this can no longer be used to deny housing projects, especially affordable housing projects. And so what the court said was, if you are going to say that you need a specific ingress or egress standard, you have to say what it is. You can't just say that you need to have sufficient ingress and egress. So if I'm Howard Blackson, this is an opportunity, right? Because what Howard would say, and this is something he wrote for CNU, is that objective design standards equal form-based codes. That if what you need is very specific formulaic design standards, you're essentially creating a form-based code, right? So, and this is sort of a typical Howard drawing. I actually think the condo building that I live in is in this picture, but what Howard would say, as it says in the headline, is objective design standards are form-based codes. And so therefore, the end result of objective design standards is to move in the direction of very, very prescriptive design standards in city after city after city. Now, whether or not Howard's right or wrong, I'm not sure. I think he's probably more right than wrong. What I will say is that, in my opinion, this does shift design review in a direction I always thought it should be shifted in, which is focus on the things that can't change easily, not the things that can change easily. I can't tell you how many design review committee meetings I've sat through where for 2 hours they discuss the color of the paint, right? And it's like, you can repaint it tomorrow. That's not a big deal. But how it's positioned on the lot, what the massing is, that will never change. I can remember in Ventura once, there was it was not a Jiffy Lube, but it was something like that. And it was a very nice building for that kind of a structure. And they had put in a indented sort of line all the way around near the top of the structure that was painted red. And That resulted in enormous public outcry and endless design review committee meetings, the end result of which was the developer had to fill in and paint over the indented line. But that's the kind of thing that isn't going to happen anymore. So I think a fair question is, can you get the good design that you want, given the fact that, number one, your ability to control density and so forth is limited, and number two, your ability to do subjective design review is limited? Can you get the design and the design criteria you want out of objective design standard, very prescriptive objective design standards? And so, as I say, in any event, design will become more standardized. So look at, this is from, I'm trying to remember who this is from. I think this is from, I don't recall where I got this from, but take a look under examples of guidelines and standards. A typical code guideline from the past would have been, and I think I have probably written this code language somewhere or other, provide articulation to reduce the apparent mass and scale of the building and to be sensitive to the neighborhood. Well, that means nothing under the new state laws. You have to change it to the much more specific design standard. At intervals of at least 100 feet of building length, there shall be a plane break along the facade composed of offset. In other words, much, much more specific detail. So I think the question is, given what we are given, the new world of objective design standards tied to ministerial approval of much larger projects, are we going to sacrifice design, or are we going to get design, good design, out of these out of these new standards and out of this new process? So that's all I'll say. Thanks very much. And I think we have plenty of time. I have a hard stop at 1, but I think we have plenty of time to beat this up and talk about it. And I would love to hear from everybody. Jonathan, I'm going to ask you to, I can't see everybody all on one screen. I don't think there's so many of you here. My gosh.
Sure, I'm happy to manage people.
Yeah,
I invite folks to raise their hands, please, and jump in with questions and thoughts.
Everyone's stunned.
This is Todd with Schmidt Design Group. Thanks for coming in and
Hi, Todd.
providing such a great presentation. I know this is a hot topic with us in the building industry. So I guess one of my first questions is, what's the regulation that holds the municipality's hand to the flame to say, hey, if we draw up these collectively agreed upon objective standards, that we will accept your project if you meet these regulations? I know they've done it in, like, I think Santa Barbara and maybe a few other places, but where have they done this successfully, and how do we hold cities accountable for allowing us to use that strategy for ministerial approval?
Well, it kind of reminds me of the old Chevron commercial where they would show all of their environmentally wonderful projects, and they would say, do people really do this? And then they would say, people do. And the answer was, people do when they're sued, because every single environmentally friendly project that they showed in their commercial they had only done because somebody sued them. And so, there's this polite term in California law called citizen enforcement, which means people sue. The Attorney General has become much, much more aggressive in suing. So have some developers. And I hate to say it, but I think cities just have to be afraid of getting sued. The Attorney General has sued only the most egregious violators, such as Huntington Beach. But there isn't an administrative mechanism at the state level to enforce this. It's mostly the threat of litigation and the good faith on the part of the cities. I will say one other thing that I didn't mention before, which is in my work for the Turner Center, when we talked about implementing these new laws, it's become quite clear that the planners at the cities are just completely overwhelmed by all these laws. They have no idea what they all say. And in my work for Turner, we talked to a bunch of developers' lawyers, including some in San Diego, and they said the only way city planners these days know how to interpret the new laws is because we tell them. Because we have the time and money to figure it out, and they don't. So city planners are under tremendous pressure to figure this out. They do not have the time. So it's not uncommon for the city to be much further behind the curve on all this stuff than the developers. One of the things I've been arguing for a couple of years now is there needs to be kind of a pause in Sacramento while we try to figure out which ones of these laws work. How can you fit them together in an elegant way rather than just passing more and more laws? But legislators, they're in the business of passing bills, so that hasn't happened.
Yeah. We had a project that got stalled by a city review because they just, a lot of it, it was an innovative project, but I don't think they had the capacity for it, and it was a little bit over their head. So in the end, it stalled. So hoping that we can find more mechanisms to implement the state's wishes to get more housing.
I will say that one of the things that has emerged is that there are public interest law firms on the YIMBY side now that are suing, so the developer doesn't have to bear the cost. One is Californians for Home Ownership, which is part of the California Association of Realtors, and the other is they changed their name. I can't remember what it is, but it's basically part of California YIMBY. So one thing that will take a little bit of pressure off the developers is that these entities will file some of the lawsuits, but of course they can't sue everybody. So it's sort of a cultural or ambient thing. Like you have to sort of be scared generally of the litigation rather than being terrified that you're going to get sued. That and to give most cities credit, I think most city planners try to implement the law. There's exceptions, obviously, but I think 80% of the cities, the planners at least try, right? And 20% of the cities don't want anything to change, so they resist everything.
So, Bill, I have a question.
Yes, Frank.
Yeah. So the objective design standards, I mean, I guess there's two sides. On one side, it's like you're going to protect against people spending hours trying to decide what color the red strip should be or not, which I think probably most of us would agree is not the intention. The other side is that good designers will do good work either way, but the vast majority of people who aren't are going to just go to the bottom line. How do you, because the pressure's gone to do great design. So how do you still create pressure to do great design under objective design standards?
That's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer to it, and I don't.
I figured
because
my experience.
I'll tell you my experience. My first experience as a decision maker and all this stuff was back in the 80s. I was one of the original planning commissioners in West Hollywood after it was incorporated at a time when there was tremendous development pressure in West Hollywood. And I was the chair of the commission at a very young age. And what we saw, and we put into place pretty strict design standards. And what we saw was some developers came in and tried to create great design, particularly in West Hollywood, right? And some developers just read the code and delivered what the code called for, and the project was crappy, right? And I think your concern, Frank, is that second approach could become more prevalent now, right? And I don't know what the answer to your question is. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I think part of it is you putting pressure on your clients, and AIA as a group, as an organization, and ASLA and APA putting pressure on the industry to ensure that this new approach actually provides a good design.
So I agree with that, and I've felt for a long time, and I've said this quite a bit, that a lot of this, I mean, we are very often sort of troubled by what government does or doesn't do to support design. But I feel we need to put, as a design culture, just like you're saying, Bill, more emphasis on directing our clients and creating a perception, even in the community, not just for a mayor or council people, but in the community at large.
The
about
expectation
the
in the community at
importance
large.
of
Yeah.
good design, so that people begin to demand it.
One of the things I've always said, and I tried to make this point in my latest book, Place and Prosperity, is that everybody is a consumer of the urban environment, but almost nobody realizes it. And average people need to be aware of the fact that what they experience every day is the result of a series of deliberate design and political and economic decisions. That's an education process that the AIA can be involved in. I know Mike started to raise his hand, but I see Jeff has his hand up, and also Jack. So let's go to Jeff and then to Jack and then to Mike. If you still want to say, Jeff, go ahead.
Hey, sorry, Vicky had her hand up before.
Oh, Vicky did.
else,
Vicky,
so-
well, of course she did. Of course she did. Vicky, go ahead. I think you're muted, Vicky, which is highly unusual.
Vicky, if it's all right, we'll move on to the next one and let you figure out your audio.
Okay, Jeff.
And I'll skip over Jack, I guess, but so I think this idea of objective design standards as form-based code is a pretty essential one, and and one of the things that we found is community plan updates, zoning laws spend a lot of time just on how much density, floor area ratios, height requirements, and they don't spend enough time on the essential components of what form-based code is supposed to be, which is the relationship between buildings and the relationship to the public sphere, because that's the essential sort of making infill development acceptable, but also, having the community building aspect of redevelopment happen. And one of the things that sort of, I think that a lot of that goes to sort of public trust, particularly on, not just the sort of the commercial projects you're looking at, but, things like ADUs and the proposals that the city made for something like SB 10 is, making sure that those things are compatible. And I think there's a couple of parts of that, but one part would be, this would be an opportunity, I think, to bring the community back in through their planning groups, because planning groups could be involved in creating the overall design standards for communities, because they frankly don't have any role anymore in actually project decisions. And so I think
that's
as a community and trust building exercise, I would highly recommend that.
That's a very good point, and I think you're quite right. It reminds me of a story, because planning and development has been so much a fight over numbers, right? If you're a neighbor and the developer wants a high number, naturally you want a low number. You have no idea what those numbers mean, right? In real life, you just want a lower number than the developer. And it reminds me, I am involved in the Turner Center, and it reminds me of a story that Don Turner once told me before he tragically died at a young age, the founder of Bridge Housing. He used to take elected officials on tours of affordable housing projects in the Bay Area, and he would play guess the density with them. And if they liked the design, they would guess a lower density than it really was. And if they disliked the design, they guessed a higher density than it really was. So I think we got to find ways to get away from numbers. Vicky, I'm sure you figured out how to articulate yourself at this point. Nope, she still has not. Jack, we'll go to Jack.
Parking. The city, I'm involved with Balboa Park, and the West Mesa has a lot of available parking, and yet on 5th and 6th Avenue, they're allowing buildings with no parking. Well, they're all going to spill off into my West Mesa Park. And so here we are with a terrible public transportation system, and it really boils down to social engineering, because we're going to end up with all these ADUs, we're requiring public parking, and it just isn't going to work. It'll be a disaster. How do we solve this?
Well, So in theory, well, the ADUs would be an exception, but in theory, what the anti-parking folks would say, well, the YIMBYs would say, given a choice between a home for a person and a home for a car, I'm going to pick a home for a person every time. But in theory, what should happen is that the developers and their investors try to assess how much parking the market needs and provide that. Now, whether that's 28 units for 28 spaces for 94 units, like Andrew Malik did on El Cajon Boulevard, I don't know. I do think that what's going to happen pretty quickly is that some of these development projects are going to sop up excess parking in these neighborhoods, right? Which is why I've always been, as a former Don Shoup student, I've always favored on district level parking management, which is what we did in downtown Ventura when I was mayor. Assessing the entire system, figuring out how much parking is available, where it is, when it's overused, when it's underused, how to price it correctly, and so forth. I think we're going to abandoning that in favor of we're just not going to have any parking requirements on any buildings, I think is probably a mistake. I think you need to do both those things. I will leave it to Jonathan to say who came next, because I've lost track.
Well, I'm going to jump in then because I kept raising my hand.
And Mike, you are next, so by all means.
But whether it's a question or a comment, Bill, and you and I have probably talked about this a number of times, but in this process where we keep talking about how to get more housing and the regulations you described earlier, and then you show that example in the Sunset District of San Francisco. Yeah, in this quest for more housing, have we lost the role of planning? If you build 5,000 units a mile away from a bus stop in a single family neighborhood, what about flushing the toilet? What about school? What about a park? Have we thought about housing isolated from neighborhoods where housing goes? And do we really need to get back to that? Which, when you said we need to have a pause, I think you're absolutely right that this hell-bent for leather quest to build as many houses as we can without thinking about what the impacts are is going to cause a problem. Maybe I'm just giving my comment, Bill, but
I would say, what I would say to that is something I've often said, which is that concentrating more of just housing and nothing else in a dense area is not always the best thing. What you want to do is concentrate lots of uses in a small location. I did a study a long time ago in the South Bay of LA where it's very auto-oriented, but there's cute little old pre-war downtowns. And what we did a very detailed, this is Marlon Barnett at USC, and I did a very detailed travel diary study in which we found that people would drive less if you put not just more housing in the center, but lots of things. So I think that's the thing I'm afraid that we're losing.
we're not building neighborhoods. That's
right. We're building housing, not neighborhoods. Jonathan, who's next?
Mahender.
Hi there. Hi, Bill. Great presentation.
Thank you.
I'm a new kid on the block. Learning the intricacies of zoning and design standards in California. But being an urban designer in my previous life, I get the sense that even if you have the best designs using urban form criteria and not looking at the architecture, you might end up with good urban design, relationship of the building to the streets, between the buildings, where the access may be and all that. But ultimately, the architecture of buildings is below standards, below what we might consider good or great. As Frank was pointing out, we need great architecture. Isn't there a concern about getting good architecture as well, along with just good urban form?
It's hard you have to be able to define good architecture. I mean, this is a debate that goes back to the beginning of new urbanism, right? Where new urbanism was indeed an intent to create better urban design, like you said. It was also a reaction against modernist architecture. And those two things got intermingled in the new urbanist movement. I think it's very hard to dictate architecture. I think it's possible, like Santa Barbara has done, to say, here's a template of architectural styles you can choose from, right? I don't think that is incompatible with objective design standards or form-based codes, but I don't think most cities are gonna do that. It's hard to once you start to say, here's the palette, it's hard to know where you should stop it and where you should continue it. That's not a great answer, but it's my best answer for today. I think some cities are willing to do it, and most cities probably won't.
Well, I understand. I mean, architectural design reviews are tough to enforce, tough to even judge for a given review committee. I had another question. The project that you showed at Bankers Hill?
Yeah, Bankers Hill.
Yeah, which is a sort of a conceptual diagram. There are no height limits in that project?
Well, they were able to exceed the height limit because they used the density bonus law.
But even then, there's no captive design heights at all?
Not really, no. I mean, that's one of the issues, is that not only does density get vastly expanded under the density bonus law, so does height. And in addition to that, in that case, so they stripped out some of the amenities that would ordinarily be associated with the project like that, because all that is allowable under state law now.
I think there should be concern about that from an urban design standpoint. You know, how much you exceed beyond a certain level should be.
It's much harder to go to Sacramento and say we advocate for good urban design than to go to Sacramento and say we advocate for more housing. You know, in Sacramento, that would be a much squishier topic. Jonathan, who's next?
Vicky, please.
Vicky.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Welcome.
Every now and then you just have to find a duct tape, and you know that fixes a lot of things. Wrap it around. What the heck is Simon doing? I'm trying to figure out what his picture is. Oh, there he is. Okay. My question, Bill, is this. I think, you know, I helped start San Diego Canyonlands, and I'm on the Groundwork San Diego, you know, board. And my concern is all this open space we've fought for, and it's, you know, designated or dedicated open space, all these canyons. My big fear is that because we got to fill in this housing, and Todd's, you know, goal of, I guarantee you come in with housing, you'll be in and out in permits in 10 days or whatever the day is, that the pressure is going to become so great. We have nowhere else to build. Let's build in these canyons, which are, some people say, worthless, which, you know, really upsets me. So how, you know, is there any fear on your part that some of the open spaces that we have dedicated throughout the city and that make San Diego unique, our canyons, are slowly but surely going to be eroded away by this need for housing? Is that a concern of yours?
That's a good question, Vicky. I hadn't thought about that. I guess I sort of assumed the answer to your question is no.
Okay.
Nobody's passed a law. Nobody's proposed or passed a law saying you can build in an open space. You can build housing in an open space zone.
Okay. That's good.
Interestingly enough, the Buffy Wicks bill that I just mentioned earlier about the builder's remedy law carved out certain ag lands and industrial properties, saying you can't build housing on those using the builder's remedy. So I think this stuff will get boxed in a little bit over time.
Good.
But I have not heard anybody say, yeah, we should build on land that is zoned or dedicated or designated in a general plan for open space.
Thank you, Bill.
Vicky, isn't the designation the difference between designated and undesignated canyon lands?
Yes. So well, there's a lot of some open space. If it's dedicated, it's got to go to the vote of the people to undedicate it. If it's designated, that's just in the community plan, which, you know, it can be overridden a lot easier than dedicated. So one of the goals of Canyonlands, and we dedicated some 20-some thousand, and I forgot how many acres, that was previously just designated. And a lot of people did not want that, and some people did. So that's one of the goals, is to preserve what we've got. And it's not just canyons, it's vernal pools, areas like that that are special that we've got to protect. So that's the issue, Todd. And I'm just concerned that still might happen. So
I'm with you 100%, and Glenn's echoed the same concern.
okay, good.
I will say there's an ongoing debate over whether these state laws will override local ballot initiatives. In general, the state trumps the locals. That has generally been the case. There was a ruling the other day about SB 10. There's a provision in SB 10 which says a city council can adopt an enabling ordinance for SB 10 and or approve an SB 10 project, even if that overrides a local density cap. And so I think what you're going to see is, in general, I think that these state laws will trump local voter initiatives. There may be some exceptions. So if you're relying on the vote to protect the open space, that would be a risk. As I say, nobody's suggested that there should be a regime change that something zoned for open space should be overridden, at least at this point.
Well, I'm glad we're not in Arizona. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time, hopefully, for one, maybe two more questions.
Two more questions. We can probably do two more questions.
Yeah. Ione, please, welcome.
So I'm wondering, along with Vicky, on other protected items like historic preservation, are there any carve-outs in any of these?
Yeah, there have been a lot of carve-outs for historic preservation. In general, for a lot of these laws, that under certain circumstances, you have ministerial approval for projects. In general, the state laws have said historic structures that the ministerial doesn't apply, the by right doesn't apply if there's a historic structure. There has been some pushback from the IMBYs on that, because their view is that the people who don't want more density are now hiding behind historic resources in order to stop things from going forward. So that may erode over time. I would think it will erode over time a little bit, but mostly historic preservation has been exempt. High wildfire risk areas have been exempt, in some other places like that.
Okay. And Patton
Maybe
Falls in San Diego only has 2% of their developable lots designated. So that to remember. 2%.
Sorry, Ione, I for one couldn't hear you with your last comment. Could you repeat that perhaps a little louder?
Sorry, Bill was saying that a lot of people are trying to hide behind historic buildings to keep housing from being developed. But while there are isolated incidences where this occurs, in San Diego, only 2% of the developable lots are designated.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very minute portion. But anyways. So.
Probably one more question, Jonathan.
I don't see any hands raised, but I will ask one, which I think we'll see what your thoughts are on this. But with the development of objective design standards, how should designers be engaging with the ongoing evolution of those standards, and what kind of policy measures are being considered or should be considered for changes and evolutions in design technology, construction methods, energy codes, etc.
Yeah, the second question is a really good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I just think given the fact that design standards are being, objective design standards are being, everybody will have to approve them. I think this goes to Frank's original point, that the design profession just has to be much more aggressive in being involved. Just as planners always say, you should be involved at the plan level, not the project level. The design profession is going to have to be engaged at that level of creating the objective design standards, in addition to the project level. It's 12:55. We got time for Susan. if she put her hand up, right?
Yes, Susan, please
Yeah.
join us.
Hi, Bill. I had made a comment in the chat that I'm not sure is correct. You were talking about a Bankers Hill project. And
Yeah.
is that the San Diego Bankers Hill project?
Yes.
Oh, okay, because that's a complete communities project. It's not a state density bonus project.
Okay. All right.
And
All right.
and I just wanted to note that.
But the waivers, I believe, came from the density bonus law.
Well, because I think some of those waivers are in complete communities, probably.
Right.
But there's some
Well,
over for sure.
Right. And what happened in that case? Yeah. Right.
Anyway, it was what was allowed on the site before complete communities was used was 52 units, and 262 are proposed, and only 8.3 or 8% of them are affordable.
Right. Okay.
So it's
right.
a lower density, it's a lower inclusionary or affordable housing requirement than our inclusionary ordinance would require, which is 10%.
Speaking of inclusionary, I would just note that the other day, Shane Phillips from UCLA wrote a report that Turner came out with that said that in terms of housing production, there's sort of a diminishing marginal return as you increase the inclusionary zoning requirement. You're less likely to get actual development. But anyway, you can go look at that if you want. I think I'm probably out of time, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Yeah, understood. And I would like to be the first to say thank you, Bill, for joining us today and making time in your schedule.
Sure.
It was a great conversation. We really appreciate you coming to join us and sharing your thoughts on the very rapidly evolving set of state and local policies. So,
okay. Well,
thank you again.
Thanks, Bill.
I'll talk to all of you soon. Some of you sooner than later, but yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
And we're staying on, right?
Yes.
Yeah, the executive committee will stay on to do a quick follow-up. And thank you everybody else for joining us today.